get started. Welcome to President Lincoln's Cottage. My name is Erin Carlson-Mast. I'm the CEO and Executive Director here. It's my great privilege to welcome you all tonight for the second in our Cottage Conversation series for 2016-2017, which is made possible in part by the generosity of David Bruce Smith. Please silence your phones at this time if you haven't done so already.
And
Following tonight's conversation and question and answer session, we will have Dr. Strozier do a book signing in the adjacent library. Please allow me to get him there first so that he's ready for all of you. If you haven't had a chance to purchase the book, you may do so in the entrance hallway of the cottage before book signing. Joining us tonight is Charles Strozier and Susan Ferentinos to discuss Dr. Strozier's new book, Your Friend Forever, A. Lincoln, The Enduring Friendship of Abraham Lincoln and Joshua Speed. Charles B. Strozier has a Harvard BA and an MA and a PhD from the University of Chicago and has training as a research candidate at the Chicago Institute for Psychoanalysis and clinical psychoanalytic training at TRISC, New York City. He is a professor of history, John Jay College and the Graduate Center, City University of New York, training and supervising analyst at the TRISC Foundation, and a practicing psychoanalyst in New York City. He has twice been nominated for a Pulitzer Prize and was made an honorary member of the American Psychoanalytic Association in 2006. He is the author or editor of 13 books, including Your Forever Friend, A. Lincoln, which was published. Your Friend Forever, sorry.
Forever Friend works also.
I don't know why I want to read it that way, too. His earlier study, Lincoln's Quest for Union, appropriate topic that you can also explore tonight if you choose, is the psychological portrait of Lincoln's childhood and youth, his marriage, and aspects of his style of leadership and character. Susan Ferentinos is a public history researcher, writer, and consultant based in Bloomington, Indiana, where she specializes in historical project management and using the past to create community. She has lectured widely on the topic of interpreting LGBT history and recently served on the planning team for the National Park Service Women's History Initiative. Dr. Ferentinos holds a PhD in U.S. history with a focus on the history of gender and sexuality, and a Master of Library Science with a concentration in special collections, both from Indiana University. She has served on the board of the National Collaborative for Women's History Sites and the Leadership Development Committee of the American Association for State and Local History. Her most recent book, Interpreting LGBT History at Museums and Historic Sites, won the 2016 National Council on Public History Book Award. And on a personal note, Sue and I met each other almost exactly 8 years ago when we attended the Seminar for Historical Administration in Indianapolis. Almost exactly 8 years ago this week. Before we ever opened President Lincoln's Cottage to the public, we received frequent inquiries about Lincoln's various personal relationships and what they meant about his presidency and his legacy. Those questions have not waned since opening. Our visitors and the public at large are inquisitive about every aspect of Lincoln's life and work, which is a truly wonderful thing. Frequently, questions cannot be answered with a simple yes or no, and that can be unsatisfying. How our culture perceives male intimacy has certainly evolved over time. Perhaps it is the nuance about Lincoln's relationships we do know, and that which we may never know, that keeps us wanting more, to understand Lincoln better, which may at times be treated as a surrogate to understanding our country and ourselves. The subject of frequent inquiries in Lincoln's relationship with Joshua Speed, who the record is clear was at least a dear and cherished friend to Lincoln. Indeed, much of Lincoln's early Springfield life might have been lost to the world without Speed's recollections. Dr. Strozier delves into this enduring friendship in Your Friend Forever, A. Lincoln, The Enduring Friendship of Abraham Lincoln and Joshua Speed. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Strozier and Dr. Ferentinos.
Thank you very much. A wonderful introduction, and I look forward to Sue's questions. And I'm just going to ramble on, tell the basic story of the book, and then we'll open it up for a conversation. As mentioned, my first job actually out of graduate school was in Sangamon State University, now part of the University of Illinois, in 1972. So I'd actually got my PhD in European history, so I sort of stumbled on Lincoln. And of course, what else are you going to do in Springfield but study Lincoln? And it became the focus of my work for the next decade. Actually, my first book came out in 1982. And one of the first things I sort of stumbled on was his relationship with Speed, and was startled that no one had written it up for him, actually, since then. And it was a chapter in my first book, and it had a kind of a life of its own, which I will talk about, and occasioned any number of books being written in the last 25 years, 30 years, disagreeing with me. So I've been watching this literature and decided, since they're all wrong, I decided it was time to deal with the subject in the depth that it deserves, and that's where this book comes from. So I'll tell you a story, and there goes my little post-it there. Not very extensive notes, and then we can get to conversation. So not 70 miles from where Lincoln was actually born in a log cabin in Hodgenville, Kentucky. Joshua Speed, 5 years later in 1814, was born to the manor born in a very large plantation that his father, John Speed, ran just outside Louisville. About 7 miles now, it's of course incorporated, but by then it was on the outskirts of Louisville. And John Speed had one wife, and then she died. There were 2 children, and then he married Lucy Fry Speed and had 10 more children, including Joshua, born in 1814. And John was a very imperious, very talented guy, and quickly built up Farmington, where he grew hemp, where they made the rope to wrap all the cotton with. And quickly built up Farmington into a major plantation, one of the largest plantations in Kentucky. By 1829, he had 62 slaves, which was a lot of slaves. A lot of slaves. It was a little village. He raised all kinds of things out, cider, and potatoes, and food for all the slaves, as well as although the main cash crop was hemp. And there were actually more slaves than that worked the crop, because when they were harvested, he would then hire other slaves. So this is the environment in which Joshua grew up. He was very close to his mother, but couldn't stand his father, John. When he went off for a little while to boarding school, came home, got sick, went off again, came home, then he wouldn't go back. He was 16 years old, and he decided to go off to Louisville, where he worked in a store for a while, did that for a few years. And in those days, he was far enough away so he did sleep on the second floor. Then in 1834, decided to move to Springfield, Illinois. Now, he was part of a wave of people coming from Kentucky, sort of talented, young professional men mostly. Sometimes they bring wives, but it was mostly men, going to Springfield because it offered opportunities that really were dwindling in places like Kentucky and elsewhere, and in Louisville, particularly after 1831, for various reasons. And he arrived in Springfield in a store, probably with either through his uncle Bell, but probably also funded by his father. He got a store, created a store on the west side of the square. Now, meanwhile, Lincoln arrived in New Salem in 1831. Having just left his father's house, the first thing he did was take a flatboat trip to New Orleans. Came back, and the owner of the ship, Gentry, hired him to run a store that Gentry was starting. So he stumbled into New Salem. He was there between 1831 and 1837, his 20s, basically, until he was the late 20s. And he tried a number of things. He tried surveying, he tried running a store. Willie Berry was the owner of the store, drank himself to death. And one endeavor after another, he really basically failed at. He began to read the law, but it took a long time for him to become a lawyer. I do the details in here. And a long, drawn-out process. He would walk to Springfield and borrow books from John Todd Stewart, but it was not an overnight accomplishment at all. He did the one area of success where he began to move forward was he was elected. First time he ran for the legislature in 1832, he didn't get elected. But then he did in 34, 36, 38, and 40. So he stumbled about. He was, in psychological terms, what psychoanalyst Erickson has called it, kind of a moratorium, where things are delayed. Crucial decisions about life are delayed. Now that makes for, I think, psychological intensity, and it also means that the choices, in the delay, the choices are sought after with, there's a great deal of intensity and struggle to try to make sure he makes the right choices. In Lincoln's case, the area, well, one of the consequences usually of young people who are in a kind of a moratorium, particularly in their 20s, is a confusion about intimacy. A confusion about intimacy and love. These are areas where there usually is deep trouble. In Lincoln's case, his first foray into intimacy and love was actually quite, initially, seemed to be on the path toward success. And with Anne Rutledge. And I don't know if you know the history of the Anne Rutledge, regarded for many, many decades as a total hoax, starting with a friend of mine, John Simon, in the 80s, and then with Douglas Wilson. Went back and really looked at the primary material, and it was, he desperately fell very much in love with Anne Rutledge. She was a wonderful young woman and adolescent girl, really, in the village. She was beautiful. Everybody adored her. Their courtship, which was very chaste, was postponed a little bit because she had been affianced to somebody who left and didn't come back. Finally, by about 1834, probably late 34, they were, she thought his fiance was never going to come back. So they were engaged to be married, and really it was a major emotional accomplishment for young Lincoln, particularly in retrospect. Didn't know at the time. On August 25th, 1835, she died. There was a typhoid epidemic that swept through the village, through central Illinois. It would happen suddenly within a couple of days. Lincoln was totally devastated, went into what was clearly a clinical depression. And one of the things that I make a lot of point about in this book is the difference between ordinary garden variety depression, which is really the source not only of suffering and sometimes psychosomatic illness, but also the source of profundity. It's hard to imagine somebody like Lincoln who could be that profound without living with a kind of sadness that characterized his whole life. Clinical depression is very different. It's almost always associated with suicidal ideation, often actual suicide attempts. It's a black hole. It brings nothing but despair and a sense of hopelessness. Lincoln and his friends went on what was basically a kind of a suicide watch. Now, you know, in Salem was 25 cabins strung out along a dirt road, so you're not going to lock people up. But they clearly watched him. They gathered around. He told a friend in the legislature, Robert Knight, he said he was afraid to carry a pocket knife, which is why at hospitals they don't allow anyone to have any sharp object. So the severity, because the witnesses were illiterate farmers, basically, and didn't tell Herndon, who did the oral history, about this until many, many years later, the full dimensions, the full intensity has been somewhat lost. But he recovered, and within a couple of years, after he became a fully fledged lawyer in the spring of 1837, he decided it was time to move to Springfield, which was not unrelated to the fact that as the leader of the Whigs in the state legislature in Vandalia, the head of the Long Nine, because there were 8 of them, and their collective height totaled 54 feet. He got them all to work together to move the capital from Vandalia to Springfield. So he was arriving as the junior partner of John Todd Stewart, who was the leading lawyer in Springfield. And so on April 15th, 1837, Lincoln rode into town on a borrowed horse from his friend William Butler. He went first to the law offices of John Todd Stewart, and he was going to sleep in the back room. And so then he wandered over to Speed's store. Now, did he know Speed? They undoubtedly knew each other in the sense that he knew who he was. Speed had already, from his reminiscences later, had heard Lincoln give some speeches and was very enamored of his speeches. They were by no means friends, but it's not accidental that he wandered into Speed's store. Wandered around, looked at some of the items, and told Speed, he said, I don't know, well, no, he asked, what would be the cost of the materials for a bed? And Speed said, well, it'd be about $17. And Lincoln said, and Speed said later, in the most saddest, melancholy face he had ever seen, he said, well, I don't have that much money, and I don't know if I can afford it, but if you'll grant it to me on credit, and this business of being a lawyer works out, I should be able to pay you by Christmas, which is April 15th. Speed said, you know, Lincoln, I have a big room upstairs where I sleep. I have a big double bed. Why don't you stay with me? Lincoln, without a word, picked up his bag, his two saddlebags with one pair of clean underwear and socks and a copy of Blackstone, walked upstairs, deposited them by the bed, came down and said, well, Speed, I'm moved. So after that, it took a while at first. Lincoln, who Herndon said was the most shut-mouth man he ever knew, was very reticent, withheld information, and particularly about personal things. It took about a year and a half before the kind of closeness that developed between the two of them really manifested itself, and they became absolutely the best friends. Speed was the only truly intimate and close friend Lincoln ever had. Men who knew Speed, and I distinguish men from women, men who knew Speed in his professional life, in his personal life as a lawyer, often tended to feel that they were his best friend. So he exuded warmth and humanity and empathy, which drew people in, but he never opened up except to Joshua Fry Speed. And they were absolutely inseparable, sort of one arm, unclear where one arm ended and the other began. Speed would often even go on a circuit with him sometimes. And I think it's worth saying, I just want to say briefly, it was certainly common for men to sleep in the same bed in this day and time. They grow up on a small log cabin, and you just put the boys in one bed and the girls in another. And it was a very familiar experience of him in New Salem to occasionally sleep with people in very crowded circumstances. Later on the circuit, the lawyers would tumble into the same bed. But just because social custom is not always congruent with individual biography. Just because it was common for men to sleep together doesn't mean it was of no significance that Abraham Lincoln slept for nearly 4 years in the same bed with his absolute best friend, Joshua Speed, at the most formative, psychologically formative experience in his life. Now, the question is, what does it mean? Okay? So, one of the things that developed in the back of this, we were talking earlier about this, a little bit of a tangent, but one of the things that developed in the back of the store, there was a fireplace in the back. So you don't make a fire in the middle of Springfield in the summer. But you do in the winter, particularly when the legislature is meeting. But it would start, I think by 1839 is when their friendship really matured. And they begin, they have kind of a salon. It's a male salon, and people gather. John J. Hardin, William Butler, Stephen Douglas would gather every night, and Speed makes absolutely clear in his reminiscences and many letters and interviews he gave to Herndon and oral history. The reason they came was because of Lincoln, and they would sit back there and tell stories and gather every night. Sometimes people would walk a mile through the muddy streets of Springfield to come to the back of Speed's store and talk with him. And it was a remarkable place. Now that's in contrast to the Hotel Heat, which was where the Edwards, Ninian Wirt Edwards, lived on 2nd and Jackson, not 4 or 5 blocks away, on what they called Aristocracy Hill. Now Ninian Wirt Edwards was the son of the first territorial governor, had gone to Transylvania University in Kentucky, in Lexington, gave the valedictory speech in Latin. He had married Elizabeth Todd, who was Mary Todd's older sister, and so the Edwards home, which only exists in pictures, unfortunately, was torn down later in the 20th century. But Sandberg says that you could fit 12 prairie farmer cabins in the Edwards home. And Elizabeth spoke fluent French, as Mary did. And they would, violins would play in the back room, and they would greet their guests in French, which is just imagine the scene in Springfield, Illinois in 1839, 38, and the opposite between the sort of very effete scene in the coterie, the Edwards mansion, versus the male salon in the back of Speed's store. Well, Speed took Lincoln there many times. Elizabeth, who was a very important source, actually, and one of the most important sources later in the oral history, in talking to Herndon for what developed. Speed brought his friend Lincoln. Speed was, of course, he raised in luxury, to the manner born, he could dance, he was smart but without being profound. Later became an enormously rich, very successful businessman, but he wasn't profound the way Lincoln was. But he was at ease socially, he could banter, he could talk, whereas Lincoln was always uneasy, didn't know how to dance. But he brought him and introduced him to the Edwardses, and introduced him particularly to Mary Todd, who came to live with her sister in late 1839. Lincoln was instantly taken with it. Within a matter of months, they'd fallen in love, were clearly talking about marriage sometime by the summer of 1840. There's a lot of disagreement about this, but the timing doesn't matter as much as the fact that they were undoubtedly talking about marriage. Lincoln married Elizabeth Edwards later said that he would sit as if transfixed, staring at her talking. And she was a wonderful, lively, ebullient woman. She could quote poetry, as I said, she fluent French, very interesting young woman, unlike anything he had known before. And they were engaged to be married. They had set their marriage for January 1st, 1841. In a move that has startled everybody since, confused everybody at the time, confused Mary, in late December, Lincoln broke the engagement. Long, complicated story. So why? This, I just would say, the reason I say wrote this book and had watched disagreements about this issue for the last 40 or 35 years, is the last major area of real disagreement in the Lincoln field. Now, people are going to keep writing books about Lincoln, but this is an area where there's real disagreement. Right? And there are two basic explanations. There's some old explanations that don't matter. But there are two real explanations. The first is that Matilda Edwards arrived in November to live at the Edwards home. She was the niece of a cousin, actually, but the ward of Ninian Wirt Edwards. Beautiful 18-year-old Matilda, flowing blonde hair, would flutter her eyes. Apparently got 22 offers of marriage within no time at all. Beautiful Matilda. So the theory, one line of interpretation in many books, is that what happened was Lincoln was suddenly taken by Matilda and broke off the engagement. The other, which is, unfortunately she died in 1850, so Herndon himself could not interview her, but Elizabeth Edwards, again, a really important source, she specifically interviewed before Matilda died. Elizabeth specifically interviewed her and told Herndon later that she said, ask her about Lincoln, what's the story with Lincoln, what happened? She said, Lincoln never stooped to pay me a compliment. That's a quote. He never stooped, capital S. He never stooped, that's as Herndon reports, never stooped to pay me a compliment. So I think the Matilda story really doesn't hold water. Right? Now the other story, of course, is that the relationship between Lincoln and Speed was sexualized, and that it was a homosexual relationship, and therefore, as the marriage approached, Lincoln got cold feet and broke off the engagement. That has generated its own literature of some significance in the last 30 years, all taking off from my chapter in my book in 1982, I must say. And and including the log cabin Republicans, I'm responsible for it. Leading up to Larry Kramer, the gay activist, who said that a friend of his in Ohio found the Speed diary underneath the floorboards of the store. And everybody thought it was a hoax because he never produced it, but we all waited for, all right, if there's a diary, and of course it talks about their sex and everything. The problem, you see, this is the kind of thing you need to do some historical research on. In fact, there was a fire in 1855, and the Speed store burned to the ground. It's in the local paper. You can read the local paper, and it's also described by Paul Lincoln. So, and also, nobody at the time ever said anything about the relationship being untoward in any way, shape, or form. Homosexuality was illegal. If there had been the slightest hint, I lived in Springfield, it's a gossipy place. It would have been, they would have picked up on it. Stephen Douglas, who called Lincoln in the 1858 debates a traitor, a ruffian, and a drunkard, would have jumped all over to win the debates in 1858. Stephen Douglas was an intimate, spent years hanging out in the back of the store at these gatherings, right? Nobody later in the entire oral history that Herndon spent years gathering, nobody ever suggested anything. And Lincoln himself talked openly. He said when he appointed James Speed to his cabinet in December 1864, brother of Joshua, who made him Attorney General, he said, he told somebody, he said, yeah, I know James pretty well, but I really knew his brother much better because we slept together for 4 years back in the old days in Springfield. So I think the question, what really happened is that it was this very close intimate friend. And what was really going on in the fall of 1840 is that Lincoln faced losing Speed. And I'm telling Lincoln stories and I'm going on too much. I'm going to try to, I'll try to get this, because I have to get to the end.
this is an important part.
I have to get to the end of the story, right? So Speed's father had died the year before, and he's going back to, he was the head of the family, and they want, Farmington was in trouble, and they wanted Speed to come home. In late August, Speed decided to return. But you didn't just pick up. It wasn't like other kinds of stores. The dry goods stores, much of the stuff was on credit, and so he started putting ads in the local paper. Nobody's ever read these ads. He started putting ads late August and September in the paper, calling in his debts. And so for the entire fall, the shadow of losing Speed, of losing this person who was his most intimate friend, his loving friend, the only person he could talk with and really be open with, he was going to lose. And in fact, they separated at the very end of 1840, and the announcement of the store closing occurred in the paper on January 1, 1841, which was the day that Lincoln was supposed to be married to Mary Todd. And in January 1841, Lincoln fell into his second, within 6 years, his second suicidal depression. He was hallucinating, which is what people often do in clinical depression. They took the razors away from him. He went to his friends, the Butler's house. They put a suicide watch on. They all stayed, and Doc Henry, his friend, and Speed, and Butler, and Butler's wife. And he was gone. He was very deeply depressed for that whole month. Gradually came out of it. Speed actually didn't leave until a few months later, but did leave, but not without extracting a promise that Lincoln would come visit him in Louisville. Lincoln goes to, in late August, September, for 3 weeks to Farmington. Stays at Farmington, has a boy assigned to him. It's Lincoln's most extensive direct experience with slavery, living with Speed in Farmington. And when they're together again, and they go for long walks, and they're very happy, and Lucy Speed takes him on, kind of a motherly figure, and takes him on. In that context, Speed suddenly falls in love with Fanny Henning, with Lincoln at his side. Speed then told Herndon later, he said, some of the same nonsense that occurred with Lincoln a year ago occurred to me when I fell in love with Fanny. So he's also terrified of intimacy and love and marriage, right? In fact, he's so terrified he has to go back to Springfield with Lincoln, and they spend the fall together. Then Speed has to go back to get married. Marriage is planned for February 15th, 1842. And Speed has to leave. And the most amazing letters that Lincoln ever wrote, the most revealing, the most intimate, the most important personal letters that Lincoln ever wrote, are in January and February of 1842, when he wrote to Speed, as Speed's marriage is approaching. He's open, he is vulnerable, he vicariously identifies with Speed and says, I know what you're feeling, don't worry about it, it'll all work out, and blah, blah, blah. The letters are really quite amazing. The crucial turning point, the emotional turning point of Lincoln's life occurs on February 25th, 1842. And I don't know why I can't find the letter here. So he got married on the 15th. Speed basically woke up the next morning and fell out of bed to write Lincoln. We don't have Speed's letters, we only have Lincoln's letters. So Lincoln writes on the 25th, I received yours of the 12th written the day you went down to Williams's place some day since, but delayed answering it till I should receive the promised one of the 16th, which is the day after Speed got married, which came last night. I opened the latter with intense anxiety and trepidation, so much that although it turned out better than I expected, I have hardly yet, at the distance of 10 hours, become calm. This is 33-year-old Abraham Lincoln, who's still shaking 10 hours after he reads the letter that could only have said one thing, that he consummated the marriage and the roof didn't fall in. Right? Two things happened after this. Their friendship sort of went, they didn't become enemies, but it dissolved. Speed had played a crucial psychological role for Lincoln. He was his best friend. He was away anyway. And their friendship was never the same. During the war, Speed came to visit him in the White House. He was a trusted old friend, and they kind of renewed things. But Lincoln was freed up because of his identification vicariously with the courtship and then marriage of Speed. And that summer, he renewed his, secretly, because of a small town, gossipy town, renewed his courtship of Mary, and who had graciously waited for him to wrestle his demons to the ground, I have to say. And they were married on November 4th. And a week later, a week or so later, Lincoln wrote in a letter to a friend, kind of added as an addendum, he said, nothing new here except my marriage, which is a matter of profound wonder.
So, as you can see, this is a fascinating book that I very much enjoyed reading. And I enjoyed reading it as a general reader, but also as a historian that works in the area of sexuality. And what I often call LGBT history, but I often instead call the history of same-sex love and desire, just because of the concepts involved in LGBT are themselves placed in history and are historically contingent. So it's something, it's a bit clunky to talk about LGBT history before the 20th century. So with, thinking about this umbrella of same-sex love and desire, I often find myself dealing with things that happened in the past and sources that, like the story of Lincoln and Speed, is actually a very similar process. Although Abraham Lincoln is, in many ways, not a historically specific. Lessons from Lincoln's life are broader. But this process of seeing in the historical sources these incredibly intense relationships, and we have evidence of two people of the same sex bonding together, loving each other, and in many cases, for far longer than 4 years, joining their lives together, living together, basically partnering together, and no evidence of sexual activity. And this, I often find myself professionally to get a little existential about this situation, because I sometimes get confused about if it ends up mattering. like, where does the actual consummation of a relationship, sexual consummation of a relationship, is that a relevant piece of the story? Or is the most relevant piece of the story the fact that they loved each other and they were terribly important to each other? And you talk a little bit about that in the book, but I'm hoping you can expand on it, and also, since you didn't touch on that in the talk.
Yeah, I mean, I think it matters if a friendship is sexualized. It matters if Lincoln and Speed had sex together. You know, I mean, not to condemn it, but to understand. All kinds of things change if that's the case, which is what this literature has been, you know, Gay Lincoln, these endless books that have been written in the last few decades. It changes the nature of what he was all about. It changes, certainly explains. It is used to explain all kinds of things about the marriage, all kinds of things about the relationship with his family, about just what person. I mean, if it's a sexualized relationship, it's a very different thing. I couldn't agree more. They loved each other. And they also, I think it occupies it, as you know, in sort of my last chapter, where I go back to Aristotle and look at friendship and Montaigne and kind of look at the way, since the Greeks, we've talked about friendship. And Aristotle in particular sort of began it. Ethics talks about it's the highest form of the good, and only the good people can really engage in real friendship. And it goes on and on. It's very interesting. And Montaigne sort of adds that it has a spiritual dimension. And it's very different from marriage. Because in marriage, or in biological relationships, you can't choose it. And marriage has all kinds of other obligations. But gay or straight marriage. You have children, you have property, but friendship is chosen. But I think they occupied it's sort of a third level. Because they slept together, they clearly love one another. You know, you can't sleep with someone for 4 years. One guy, 6'4", on an old creaky bed filled with corn husks probably, and another guy, you know, without turning your arm over. There had to have been some sort of accidental contact, maybe, you know, other, whatever. And yet it does matter that it wasn't sexualized. But it fitted into a place and time. It's so different from the way we think about male friendship now. It's so different that it's hard to go back in time and place yourself